So welcome everybody. So nice to have such a nice group for this book club, and thanks for bearing with us with all the drama with the book and getting it and from where and how to make it happen. But it is a hard to find book, and as I was just mentioning, I know of at least of two other book clubs that thought about having this book, but then abandoned it because it was too complicated to get it. So I thought we're just going to push through, do this book because many people I know. So this is just a really good book to explore these topics and to get thinking about it. And so my plan is to do once a month for a few months and see how it goes and if we accelerate. But this is what works right now with my schedule and synagogue schedule. But before we start, maybe we should go around and have everybody just say their name and introduce themselves very quickly.
I'm Kay Greenfield.
Jay.
Hello, Calvin. Karen Berlin. Norma Berlin. Sharice Rosen.
Norris Ackerman.
Laurel Saltzman.
John Dempsey. Ian Colton.
And people online, do you want to take a turn to introduce themselves? Everybody can see a name.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Got my.
So if one of you could unmute yourself and just introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Cindy.
Hey, Oxen.
Octavio.
Suzanne Fournier.
Oops.
Diane Brown.
Okay. I think it's it. Well, thanks everyone, and I think what I'm going to do this time for the first time is talk a little bit about Aryeh Kaplan before we get into the book. And this is a discussion, so if anybody wants to just jump in, ask a question or make a comment and all of that, please do. But I wanted to introduce Aryeh Kaplan, both because I think it really sets the stage for his book and the whole conversation about it and the sessions ahead. And also because I have a little bit of a personal connection there as well, which I think why I chose this book. But Aryeh Kaplan, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, wrote a number of books on Kabbalah and Jewish meditation, but he also wrote some very important books that have nothing to do with Kabbalah, but they're those Jewish books. He has a translation of the Torah, which is probably my favorite translation of the Torah. It's called the Living Torah. And he has a number of books that are still considered to be like the canon for people who are becoming religious. Books about Judaism and practice and all kinds of things. And he has an unusual story. Some of this is from Wikipedia, some of it I knew from before at other places, but he grew up and where he wasn't a religious Jew, and there were some issues in his family, and he ended up living on the street when he was in his early teens in the Bronx. He was a street kid until his mother passed away when he was 13. And then someone encouraged him to go say Kaddish, and he went to some synagogue, and someone recognized, didn't have to fill it out, he didn't know what he was doing, and started talking to him. And he already was, even though I guess he was a street kid, he was considered a prodigy when he did go to school. And he went from knowing nothing to within a year, he was studying the Torah in Hebrew. By the time he was 18 or 15, he enrolled himself in the yeshiva. And by the time he was 18, he was chosen as a handful of students to study advanced Talmud. He's had a complete facility with all of it. After he finished studying Talmud, he went to Israel and studied in the hardest yeshiva to get into, Harvard yeshiva as the Mir. And then he got his religious ordination there, but that wasn't his whole journey. He became a religious school teacher in some Orthodox places around America. But then he went back and he went to college and he studied physics. And he did all this research in physics and got a fellowship and was recognized, and he was a genius in it. And so he did really well. But then he decided he had this calling to be a rabbi. So he went back and was a rabbi, pulpit rabbi, including at a conservative synagogue and some Orthodox synagogues. And then he went on and wrote a lot of books. And he died at 48. So he has like 12 to 15 books, which are, his books on Jewish meditation are the foundation of modern Jewish meditation. And so he was considered, in many circles. I'm going to read a quote a little bit later about how he was recognized in his day, because he passed away in '83, so it's been a while since he's been around, but he was considered a really important figure. But for our purposes today, they say that even as a child, exploring a little bit of spiritual background, he was one of those people who saw colors when people spoke, and his senses were, he says even with physics, he was kind of like Einstein. He had those eureka moments, and like in the bath, where suddenly things would pour into his mind, and he wrote papers or discoveries in that way. But through all of it, he also had these spiritual practices, which were not what other ultra-Orthodox people were doing. Like he would repeat God's name, just like a mantra almost again and again and again. And he was really had this sense of talking about experience. For him, religious experience was the core of understanding religion. And so he talks about all kinds of all different kinds of experiences that he all groups together as meditation. He calls it all meditation. For him, studying Kabbalah, which is even in all his other work is there in the background. But when he was studying the text, he found it wasn't enough. So what he did is he would gather together like a group of psychologists, because he felt that Kabbalah was about consciousness, and he had this group of psychologists, and he would run his ideas by them. He wouldn't get a group of other Kabbalah scholars, but he'd work with psychologists and run all of his interpretations and thoughts with them, instead of going to others when he was trying to translate. Because his original idea was that he thought that the real meaning of almost all these texts had been lost. And what we have is just the layer of it, the outer layer. And to really understand it, you had to have the experience part. And so he was always trying to get back to that experience. A lot of what he was looking for, and he kind of came out of the '60s, and when there were other kind of religious searches going on, in the culture. He was all about looking for the power of Kabbalah, the energy of Kabbalah, and he wasn't as much interested in. He was interested in the theory and how to relate it to the world, but for example, he studied in depth how when you do the priestly blessing, you're supposed to put the spot hands up, right? So he would say, but that's because how energy runs in the hands, and he would try and relate that to other traditions. And he was Orthodox, so he wasn't super open to other religious traditions, but they say that he got a lot of their books and studied them, and just to compare and to elucidate, that he really felt because he lived at this time where there were a lot of people who were Jews who were exploring other religious traditions, Buddhism and Hinduism and everything, and that whole ferment of '60s and '70s. And he found that compared to the other students in his time, they had more experience and more religious experience. So he was all about, well, how can we bring this into Judaism? And this is how can you talk about it? So he did study other traditions to some degree. And so I wanted to read a little bit of some of the stuff that he wrote. This is from his meditation books. Try for a moment to stop thinking. You remain completely conscious that there are not verbal thoughts in your mind. If you are an average person, you may be able to maintain such a state for a few seconds, but immediately your mind begins to verbalize the experience. You might say to yourself, I am not thinking of anything. As soon as you do this, of course, you are actually thinking of something, right? So that's meditation. Or this is another of his quotes from this book. This is like trying to get a very weak radio signal and picking up a lot of static. If you have a good radio, you can tune it, cut down the static, and pick up a clear signal. Similarly, high-level meditation requires that you first eliminate all mental static. You may then be able to pick up a very faint signal that you cannot really hear. The next step is to carefully start tuning up the volume. Now imagine what will happen if your mind is not controllable yet when you turn up the volume. You will get your signal, the static will actually cause a devastating shock. So this is him trying to explain why Kabbalah was protected for so many years, because if you're not, in his mind, if you're opening up your inner door and your mind isn't a little bit quiet and it starts to flow in, it might get a little bit intense. And so I wanted to read actually this one. This is to give you a sense that he's not only a Kabbalist. This is a comment that was made by NCSY, which is the Orthodox version of USY. It's the Orthodox Youth Movement. And he worked with, he was their main publisher of NCSY, and he was also a counselor for all the Brooklyn area of the Orthodox kids. And so this is what they write about him as a tribute to him. In a sense, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan was a meteor, a dazzling light that illuminated the darkened skies of post-Holocaust Torah learning, but burned out far too soon, because he died so young. With his scientific background, Rabbi Kaplan might have pointed out the inaccuracy of this comparison. More likely, his modesty and unassuming demeanor would have led him to deflect this much-deserved praise. And that, in a nutshell, is the life story of Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Few, if any, have had a greater impact on the Jewish spiritual awakening, often called the Tshuva movement, which is all the people that did Tshuva became religious again. While other religious leaders sent out emissaries and still others opened yeshivot, Rabbi Kaplan directly and personally impacted an almost unfathomable number of Jews, primarily through NCSY, but also through his prolific writing. Rabbi Kaplan's writings are straightforward and clear, yet profound, with Kabbalistic doctrine always just beneath the surface. Anyway, it goes on, but just talks about, here it talks about some of the other things he did. He used scientific tools and his own analytic skills to organize and categorize overwhelmingly vast Jewish sources, creating an invaluable 2-volume Torah encyclopedia, the Handbook of Jewish Thought. Just some of the stuff that he wrote, he's just prolific, and he created things, and people might compare him to a Dean Steinsaltz. I find him to be, if you've heard of Dean Steinsaltz, who wrote a Hebrew translation to the Talmud and an English translation, and was on Time magazine as the greatest Jewish scholar of the last 1,000 years. I think Aryeh Kaplan, in some ways, is an even greater scholar because of how profound his writings are. And so this now my personal connection to him, which is not direct, but as many of you know, my father is a rabbi. And my father had a school of Jewish thought and meditation in the old city in Jerusalem in the 1980s. It was called Chokhmat Halev, Wisdom of the Heart. And one of the teachers there, he had a lot of really important teachers in this small school who were teaching similarly to what Aryeh Kaplan talked about in his book and others, Kabbalah, Hasidism, meditation. The latest translator of the Zohar, Danny Matt taught there, and Shlomo Carlebach, and Reb Zalman. A lot of these teachers taught at my dad's school, including Gedalia Fleer, who was a teacher of Rebbe Nachman, and at his time, a long time ago now, beloved. And he was Aryeh Kaplan's best friend. So my dad heard all about him, and he died in '83, which was a year after my dad opened his school. So he didn't have the chance to meet him. But I think it's all connected though, because they were asking the same questions, all these teachers at this time. This is a description online of my father's school by Alan Brill, who also did a lot of research on Aryeh Kaplan that I was quoting earlier. This is about my dad's school, and just because it opens up the feeling of this whole time period. Once upon a time, there was a magical place in the old city of Jerusalem that seemed like an entrance into a wizard's den. The place had tall windows and offered classes, talks, and celebrations, but it seemed more like a gathering of special people in the Tolkien Middle-earth party. I had no idea about the place, and I did not really know its organizer, other than it was worth reading their wall flyers of classes to see if I wanted to drop by to attend one. My last visit was in 1987 when I heard the singing of a tish happening from outside the window, and I entered for a while. And so my dad was similar to Kaplan and others. They were interested in the experience, the religious experience. The Tao is what led to understanding all the other stuff. And then without the religious experience, it was hard to make sense of the other. Hi, Peter. Great to join us. And so this is what I think links my whole orientation of Judaism to Aryeh Kaplan, that it's all about what makes Judaism real and alive, and what's the experience of it that makes you understand the other with a lot more clarity and depth. And so I think we're going to begin in a minute going through the book. Anybody have any thoughts or comments before we start looking at the book itself? So just to summarize, Aryeh Kaplan died at 48, but was a genius who wrote tremendous amount, absorbed encyclopedic amounts of Torah, turned it into both books on Kabbalah and meditation, but also he wrote a translation of the Torah. He absorbed all the commentaries of the Torah and put it into one little volume and this tremendous photographic memory. But for him, it was all about understanding starting with religious experience, and from there trying to understand what all the old teachings that were received came from.
Did he have a family?
He had 9 kids. He met his wife in Kentucky, and they had 9 kids, and died at 48 of a heart attack. So very young, and who knows what he would have been able to achieve if he didn't. But he really started. Maybe a last point. He wrote 3 books on Jewish meditation, and until then, a lot of this stuff was very obscure, right? The old Kabbalah, they always said you had to be 40 years old, married, and male to be able to learn any of it. And he was one of the first people who opened it up to people. And the other people who talked about it before him were scholars who were really interested in the imagery and the cultural context, but they didn't take it as real wisdom or understanding of how to live your spiritual religious life. But he did it. And what I appreciate a lot about him is that in some ways he's a little too frum for me. He's a little bit too religious in what he's talking about, but he's also open. And I think because he had this whole period of his life where he wasn't religious, and then he lived in the 60s and went to university in the 60s. And I think he encountered secular culture. He brings in all kinds of interesting things. And if you read between the lines, in all kinds of places, you see he both brings a traditional understanding, but then he starts talking about other things too, which elucidate the subject matter in ways that are very hard to find in other places. And so the first chapter, it was just short, 8 pages, really about the basic of Kabbalah. And then it gets more intense afterwards. So the other chapters are longer, and we'll get to them afterward. Anybody have any comments or thoughts on the first chapter? And I have a little something I want to talk about, and then we can open up for discussion.
It was really interesting, I thought. I mean, just the whole idea that there wasn't just, oral Torah encompassed way more than I think we normally think of it as. And then it makes total sense that all the kind of extra spiritual stuff that goes up, it was lost. I mean, how could you pass that down? Because that's like it's a term I'm looking for. You pass that from person to person. It's not written.
You can't, even if it's written, it doesn't always mean something if it isn't passed.
Right, you need the person.
There were 2 things that struck me.
Yeah.
Reading this, I did read it heavily. But it is, one of them is that it was essentially an oral tradition
Yes,
that hadn't been written down
yes,
until maybe 1,000+ years ago.
yeah,
So, and that was when it was first allowed. And it makes some very interesting comments about that stating that when that can be written. The other thing that kind of gets me is that it is in effect,
yeah,
and perhaps I'm going to paint myself into a corner, but it is a hypothetical classroom. So it is almost like discussing quantum physics. And in doing so, you, and it states it explicitly that in order to understand it, you have to essentially be a scholar of Torah. So without a overreaching, broad, and very, very deep understanding
Yeah.
of the substance that goes behind it,
Yeah,
it is almost too obtuse
yeah,
to be accepted. So it's daunting.
yes.
I'm willing to take a dive, but I'm afraid that, with my limited intellect, I will only be able to get my toes into the water.
So I'm really glad you brought that up, and I was gonna address that directly and say, I think it's not true. That, and I think that, and I'm gonna talk about it a lot, I think, but that, one of the things in this first chapter that comes up a lot is he talks about, right, it started with Moses and it went to Joshua, and then he really talks about that, how it's gone on from person to person to person. But it's not information. The word he uses is transmit, right? So transmitting is that it's not just transmitted, here's some information. And in fact, I think that the information part in some ways is not the most important. It's not like there's some secret information that you need to have studied all this midrash and Torah and Talmud to understand. I think that if you can get a feeling for the experience of what they're trying to describe, then you can have access to it without all the other. And it's true, to understand all the intricacies of some of these texts, you have to have that background. But a lot of what this does is simplifying it, so you don't have to have all of that. And a lot of the places in Kabbalah, this is my point of view, where it's bringing all these complex stuff, I think is coming sometimes not purposefully, because of our overactive Jewish mind and of the rabbis who were themselves so steeped in it, and they were trying to explain their own experiences through the language they knew, which was the language of Talmud and Midrash and all these things. But if you can strip it down, then you get actually to the simple core truths, because my belief is spiritual truths are, like any truth, are simple. If you hear them, they make sense to you because they're a truth, and they work with your understanding of they're intuitive. And I think that most spiritual truths, when you hear them, you say, oh, somehow I knew that, right? Like in the back of my mind, I had the feeling that was true. And I think it's true for all of this. And he kind of alludes to this in other places. And, one of the things he says is, you need, all of Kabbalah is to help you understand Torah better, right? So he's telling you that not because I think Kabbalah is there to help us understand every word of the 5 books of Moses so we can become like Rashi and study it better. But he's referring to Torah in a much wider sense. He's referring to Torah as like the wisdom about the universe. There's this Hasidic idea that Torah isn't just this document, these scrolls we have inside our ark, but rather it's the opposite. Those scrolls we have in the ark was what our ancestors 3,000 years ago were able to receive what the Kabbalists call the supernal Torah, the heavenly Torah, which is kind of like the DNA of the universe, the collective unconscious, or however you want to put it. And so when you study Torah, you can connect to that other greater Torah that reveals truths about yourself and the world, and your experience of relationships, and your experience of knowing yourself, and your experience of the inner world, which is really what Kabbalah is all about. Kabbalah's argument, actually, let's hear a few more comments before I get into more. Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a much more skeptical
Go for it.
reaction to the beginning of it,
Okay, sure.
which was that, okay, so he thinks that Moses, in addition to the 5 books, he carried the entire Talmud down and all the Zohar with him. And it was sort of very ahistorical. That part of me was wanting to know, well, wait a minute. So I thought the Zohar was written in the Middle Ages in Spain, So, and there's these theory, and it's something that was important enough for him to begin the book with this theoretical framework that it all came from from Moses,
Mhm.
which wasn't really, from a very, from,
From a scholarly point of view,
Yeah.
it's not, so I think that, and this is, to me, that this is where you have to read afterwards, because he's both trying, he feels that he has to, as an Orthodox rabbi, give the canon. I mean, that's the canon, right? That's the Orthodox canon. And this is the first Mishnah of Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. Moses received the Torah and gave it to the next one, and they gave it to the next one, they gave it to the next one, right? That's Pirkei Avot. But if you look at it, he says it wasn't only the information that was given, it was the prophetic experience, and uses the word transmit a lot. So I think actually what it's talking about, Moses did not have all the Zohar, and did not have all the Talmud, did not have all of that on Mount Sinai. But what Moses had was a certain experience and power. More than anything, what he was interested in is power. And you see this throughout the Torah, the Tanakh itself, the Hebrew Bible, that what the prophets were really all about was transmitting power. So one of the great moments in the Tanakh, in the Bible, is when the prophet Elijah, right? Elijah comes to Passover meals and everything, and to every bris. He's about to die. I don't know how many of you have heard this story. So Elijah is about to die, and he has one student who's Elisha. And so he goes with his student Elisha, and all the prophets, because in the Torah they speak of schools of prophets, which are places where they learned Kabbalah, however it was back then. But that he went with his student Elisha, and they crossed the river, and a little miracle happened. And finally, Elijah asked his student, "What do you want from me? I'm about, this is my last few moments." And so he says, "I would like 2 times your power. I'd like twice your power." And so Elijah says, what you've asked of me is something very great. But if you see me when I die, then you will be granted what I've given you. So what happens then, the Tanakh says, is he disappears and he sees Elijah not die, but go up in the chariot of fire. Who knows what he actually saw, right? But that's how he describes it. And then Elisha takes his mantle, right? Passing the mantle, right? This is an English. He takes Elijah's mantle, puts it on him, and he walks back, and all of the other prophets say, they can see Elijah's spirit is on you. And then actually, it's this prophet Elisha who's the greatest miracle worker in the whole Tanakh, in the whole Bible. And so we know, not to say anything but other traditions, but we speak of Jesus coming back from the dead, or bringing other. Elisha brings children back from the dead in the Tanakh. He creates food he destroys art. He's the most powerful of all the prophets, probably, in some ways. And so there's this idea that the prophet, it was about an energy that was passed down. That's what was passed down from, and with the energy came all of these things. But actually, this is part of what I wanted to talk about, that the Kabbalistic view, and this is really a different view of all of Torah and of all of Judaism, is that to Kabbalah, all of the Torah is a document for living spiritual life. And all the moral and ethical laws are in the Torah, were to train the Jewish people to be able to hold the divine energy, because you have to be able to live that moral and ethical life to be able to hold that divine energy. In other words, God says, be a kingdom of priests. And so when you live a certain way, then your vessel can hold that energy, and then that energy has a power to transform the world. I guess if you're a prophet, through miracle, but even if you're not a prophet, because that's what brings into consciousness that when we talk about the lamb will lie down with this, that's not going to come about by people doing just good deeds, but it's a change in consciousness, where you come to a place where that consciousness, which is an energy, which is a state of mind, it permeates so much of the world that it creates this then rundown behavior. And so to the Kabbalists, the stories of Abraham and Sarah are the stories of their spiritual journeys of learning how to hold these energies and these thoughts. And you actually see this throughout the Torah in all kinds of ways, that this is actually part of what the Torah is about. Moses, right? Moses talks about wanting all other people. There's these different moments where Moses transmits some of his power to other people, and that enables the other people to then carry on God's will, or to judge the people or to do different things. And there's this moment as well where, in the book of Numbers, he's so full of power that suddenly something happens and there's these two people who catch some of that power and start prophesying. And Joshua, who's going to take over after Moses, gets really upset and runs up to Moses and says, we got to get rid of these two. They're prophesying. And Moses says, if only everybody was a prophet, because that's the goal, right? Everybody should have some of this power running in them, a state of consciousness, which brings you to live in this way. And so when he says it was transmitted to Joshua and did this, it wasn't that he sat down with Joshua and says, let me spend 2 years with you and talk the entire Talmud to you and talk the entire Zohar with you, which is impossible. But rather what it says in the Torah is he put his hands on his head and transmitted some of that power. That's what it says in the Torah, right? And then people saw Joshua had Moses's power in him and was able to do some of that. So what the Kabbalists believe is that the spirit was what was passed. This is what was passed down. This is what the real Kabbalah was. This is what was taught in the schools of prophets. Of course, there were teachings around it and techniques around it, but that the Torah, all the stuff in the Torah, was in its own way a manual of how to live to be able to achieve this life. But that at a certain point, this is when we talk about the secret of that's what the Torah was about was lost. And instead, because we were in exile, we had to just focus on survival, and we had to focus on just we lost touch. But the purpose of all of it was to hold this spirit, hold this energy.
Wanted to ask one thing.
Go ahead.
The statement that I read was, to really get Torah, we need Kabbalah.
Yes.
So what was the attraction? It must be like 20 years ago to all the entertainers who all of a sudden wound on to Kabbalah. They didn't study Torah. I mean, they were basically interested in that.
Yeah.
What was it? Was it just a fad they were?
So, I mean, the truth is that the people who started the Kabbalah Center, right? So I actually live in LA. I happen to live I happen to live a few blocks away from it. So I saw the people who went to it and they were all dressed in white. And I was always looking for Madonna, but I never saw her. I guess she came in probably in the limousine and through the back entrance. Right. But they had a beautiful space. But the people who started that were actually very real. Their Kabbalah was a real Kabbalah. But I think they went off the road and got into all kinds of stuff. But I think they had some of this power with them, which is why people were attracted to it. But they got too much into, I'm going to sell red strings and I'm going to sell holy water and then I'm going to promise you eternal life and I'm going to and if you come to me, the more money you give, the more levels of teaching I'll give you and all these things that made it. That's my view. But they also did a lot of They also spread a lot of Kabbalah, which was good. So actually the copies of the Zohar that are the most prevalent worldwide are Kabbalah Center copies because they have a lot of money. So they're able to disseminate it and to send it to a lot of people. They have conventions and a lot of what they taught was real Kabbalah. It was real, but I think they kind of went to Hollywood and which is fine for some things, but maybe in my mind at least, not to be too judgmental when you're dealing with this stuff. It shouldn't be too much because this stuff, once you lose that, then I think it's easy to get distracted from it.
I'm reading the commentary from that right now.
Yeah.
On Genesis.
What do you think? Is it good?
It's good. Yeah. They have a full 5-series commentary with the Zohar mixed in verse for verse, written by the Kabbalah Center. It's really good. It's really well written. They do talk a lot about immortality though. A lot. They're really obsessed with immortality. Yeah, and some of it you're reading, it just doesn't make sense. So you skip that paragraph, but the rest of it's really good.
I have a question.
Sure.
When you're referring to power and passing down this power, are you
Yes.
referring to the power that you're speaking of knowledge?
I'm so glad you asked, and I think it's more spiritual than that. It's more like spirit, and the way I would talk about it was that they would say that spirit is everywhere, right? And what's the difference between when you hear anybody talk, whether it's a spiritual subject or not, and their words kind of resound with you when you remember that talk for 10, 20 years, and the talk that you hear it and it just feels flat. And they would say it's not about the eloquence, but it's about the power of the speaker, right? We talk about the power of the speaker. They put power into their words. And Kabbalah talks a lot about the power of words. So that there is you could put spiritual power into words, obviously into prayer and the different things. And to do that. So a speaker has that, all the more so Moses has that, or a spiritual teacher. And I think we all experience spirit in our lives in different ways. But spirit, they would say, is the force that draws us to people, especially religious leaders or others. But they would say that, people in Kabbalah, we live in a web of spirit. Everybody's interconnected, and science doesn't corroborate that. Some people would say yet, maybe, just like, so this is the way I would have this conversation with the dean of my rabbinical school a lot. The dean of my rabbinical school, Rabbi Brad Artson, and I were on different pages about this, but he was very spiritual and he was into all these things, but he said, science will never be able to prove any of this because it's in the realm, because he says it's the realm of music, metaphysics, meditation, and poetry. So it's poetry. How could science ever understand it? And I says, well, if you think it's real, and I don't see any reason why science would not be able to. And then I once had this argument with him, but I said, well, what about the first people who were watching the clouds and saw it as something beautiful and didn't understand the science of it, right? But one day he understood the science of it, and he said, and he said, yeah, but it took away the poetry of being able to see the sky. And I said that, so he was saying that a scientific understanding of spirit takes away its beauty and poetry. And I said, well, actually, I think it helps us understand it more. It actually increases our understanding of it. So Kabbalah really is like on some level the science of spirit. And will science, in my mind, one day be able to measure all of this? Potentially, why not? Why not? If it's something that we experience, then there's people for thousands of years have experienced spirit. And so if anything, what was passed down was knowledge, but the knowledge only made sense with this experience with it. And I think we've all had that. You can read a book and you don't understand it. If you have an amazing teacher, it's not just their elucidation of it, but their state of mind when they teach it, right? A really good teacher, they hold the state of mind of what they're teaching, right? Like they embody it. And so like a really good teacher in college or anything, when they're teaching something to you and embodying that teaching, they're not just transmitting knowledge or transmitting a state of mind to you, right? That's the most exciting teaching you can receive, right? You receive their state of mind and it transforms you because you not only understand new knowledge, but you have a whole new way of looking at life. And so this is kind of what they're talking about, but even in a more directed way. What Moses was transmitting was a state of mind, but it came with power. It came like the people who were, as he was speaking about it, they held on to what he was saying, and it went down. And this is what then eventually was lost, and then became what was then handed down. Instead of being the experience, was more the informational part. But the informational part about the experience just feels very empty, right? It's just words, and a lot of it, what they call secrets. I don't think it's secrets. I think it's just, it doesn't make sense if you don't have a state of mind to understand it. Just as if you had no background and no teacher, but you picked up a book of philosophy, of really intense philosophy, and you just started picking it up, you would probably not understand any of it, right? Unless you had unless you had a deep introduction to it, all of that, even then, but you need to learn it from another person. And so Kabbalah, even more than philosophy, right? People say where philosophy stops is where Kabbalah begins, is where a lot of this had to be. Anything, go ahead, Hinda, go ahead.
Rabbi,
Yes, go ahead, please.
Rabbi, I have a question that you probably can't answer.
Uh-oh.
I've been struggling with it for my whole life. I think one of the reasons I took this class was to see what was in the Kabbalah, but my father, why he forbade me from ever reading it. He had lots of books on Kabbalah and Zohar, has all of them. He would not let me read any of them. He said, "You're not ready to read them." I was a teenager. And he said, "This is not the time, I won't let you read them." So now I'm trying to find out why. Now, of course, he's not here to ask. My father was a biblical and Talmudic scholar, an Orthodox rabbi, and he read the Zohar and all that comes with it, but I wasn't allowed to. What's going on here? Are there pieces of the Zohar that I should be worried about, afraid it might change me too much?
So this, as I said before, this is what Kabbalah was for 2,000 years, which is you have to be male, you have to be married, and you have to be 40 years old to study it. Which in an old patriarchal society meant that you had to have a stable mind, right? And because you're touching on spirit. I don't think you're gonna read some kind of content that's gonna somehow warp your something. I think it's that the spirit behind it can be confusing, right? Or it can be too much. But my point of view is that we live in a very different world than those who came before us did, for many reasons. One is spirituality in general is a lot more part of just the general culture that we live in. Second of all, our culture is much more open and connected. The whole world is connected in all these different ways. And so we have all kinds of information. The old world was a lot more, closed off. People lived in silos. And I think if you were just your average person going about your life and suddenly you came in contact with this, it could blow your fuses a little bit, and so, but I think in our day and age where we're, talking on video chat to people across the world and absorbing all kinds of knowledge from all kinds of places, going on Wikipedia with one side of our mind or the other is answering a text and a message, our minds are just a lot more nimble and able to take in this stuff. And I also think that the general state of mind of our culture is in a very different place than where it was 100, 200 years ago. People, for all the craziness in our world, which is a lot of craziness, we live lives where most of us don't have to worry about, violence at any moment, and we live more in our minds, we live less in physicality, where our culture is just opened up in a much different way. And so I think that there's now an ability to take these ideas in and to think about them. But I think that, like everything in Judaism, that tradition got passed down and then became too much like a law instead of a custom, which was, you should be stable in your life before you start learning about this. But it's true that if you're very attached to the whole idea that the world is just physicality and that's all there is, and then maybe these ideas might be hard to take in. But the Kabbalah's ideas is that the outer layer of life is the least of it. And my part of my understanding is, for most of us, even though we live obviously a very physical, concrete life, our inner life of thoughts and dreams and emotions and this is a much more important part of our life even than what happens on the outside, because that's what directs everything, right? Where you are in your mind is how you experience life, right? You could be in the most beautiful place in the world. You could be on top of the best mountaintop, but if your mind's in the office, and that's where you are, right? And if you're in the office and you're thinking about the mountaintop, and that's where you are. And so I think, the inner part of our life is the most important on some level of what brings us meaning in life, what brings us well-being, peace, and all the things. And so I think more so now than it was hundreds of years ago. And so I think that the study of these things are really enriching to life and open up a different way of looking at life and a way of looking at spirit and religion. And also in Judaism itself, Kabbalah was an intrinsic part of Judaism. So even though, Hinda, you're not the only person whose parent who was your father was a rabbi, wasn't he?
Yes.
So
Yes.
a lot of rabbis or scholars would tell, don't study Kabbalah to this, but the Judaism of 150 years ago was replete in Kabbalah. Half of our prayers still to this day in the Siddur were all Kabbalistic. Kabbalah Shabbat, the Friday was all Kabbalah. And when Judaism came over to America, the people who brought it, a lot of them didn't want to, they said, this is not rational, or this is not, so they cut it out of Judaism. But if you look at Judaism's really suffered without, that part of religion that makes it alive. And, our synagogues are empty and a lot of people are going away from Judaism. And they also went to other religions, right? If you go to the greatest teachers of yoga and Buddhism, they all have Stein in their name because they're all Jews, because they, it's in our blood, I think, for Jews to have this aspect. And if you don't find it in your own synagogue, and you're going to go look for it somewhere else. It's part of our our most important moment in the whole Torah when God says, "Will you be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation?" That's what the covenant was about. And the people said yes. So what does it mean to be a priest? It means this whole orientation in life. And so, of course, all the other things, right, through 2,000 years of exile, developing our mind has been really important also, and the Jewish mind, and arts and culture and all these things you've contributed to. But I think you mix that with this also, it creates an even more powerful contribution. And of all of our contributions, which is the one that's the most enduring? The Bible, right? The Bible is holy to billions of people in the world, billions of people. And it came out of a small people living in a small country in the middle of the desert. And that's probably the most important book of mankind, a little Western centric, but you could make that argument. And so where did it came out? It came out of a society that talked about these prophets transmitting the power in this way. It came out of all these things. And we still read those words in shul every week. And those words, you read the prophets, and that ancient poetry that's 3,000 years old still can strike you, because it's what Kabbalah will say. It's full with the power, which is more important than the words itself, right? It's the power. First one.
On page 7.
Yeah.
He's talking about the 3 different types of Kabbalah.
Yes.
And what I don't understand is the last one that he mentions is practical Kabbalah.
Yes.
And then he goes on to say practical or magical Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't quite understand that.
So the Kabbalah, especially in the Middle Ages, as other spiritual traditions, got into what we would call magic. So it's not my line of country so much, but I remember hearing from someone who was in a synagogue in Israel, for example, and a Kabbalist was invited that weekend for whatever, it was and they were reading through the list of captives taken by Rabbi Hamas, I don't know who it was, and they were reading, at a certain point, they read a name, and the Kabbalist said, like this, like no. And they found out, like, not later, that was true, but that was dead. And so it was like, somehow there was a sense, an ability. So that's kind of like magical Kabbalah, but there's also a lot of amulets. There was a lot of, using, all kinds of things. I mean, the most famous one, I don't want to get into too much into this because I don't find it as interesting as the bigger ideas and the whole concepts, but there was this whole idea in Israel of that there's also, Kabbalist curses, and there was one that, the 1,000 lashes of fire or something, and apparently it was done right before Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel, suddenly got his thing, and it was done for other people, and so there's all these ideas, I don't know quite what to think about all of that, but there's that whole other side to Kabbalah, which to me is actually a denigration of Kabbalah, because for me the purest Kabbalah is about reaching God and goodness and oneness, being aware of that. That's what Kabbalah is really about. And once you got into the magical and this, all that stuff is interesting. I think that takes you off the goal. The goals for the prophets are always to know God and to, from God, bring truths to other people about, hey, how are you going to live in the world and how are you going to make the world a better place and all these kinds of things.
Not by making golems.
Not by making golems, exactly. Golem was a Kabbalistic thing in the thing, but you know, there's a lot of Kabbalists. So Kabbalah has that, which is part of why there was this thing. Don't learn Kabbalah. I know I have a friend who has a whole copy of the Zohar, and she won't open it, but she just likes having it around. This is like a family friend. I'm like, and the truth is that you open the Zohar, and it's not going to actually help you that much with because a lot of it's written in very dense form, and it's not. We'll talk about the Zohar, and it's kind of the Zohar is kind of like jazz. You have to appreciate the flow and ebb and flow of it, and it does require knowledge of all these things. But to get to the spiritual truths, you don't need to read all of that.
So you're saying that the meditative
Yes.
Kabbalah is what you're interested in?
I'm interested also in the metaphysical and the theological. I'm interested in all of it, but I think that the meditative Kabbalah is the core of the whole Kabbalah, and that's what he talks about. That the prophetic element was transmitted from Moses down in this, because he talks about it in all of his books that without the meditative, without the experience, you can't understand all the other. The other becomes either fun and interesting, which it might be, but it doesn't become real. And it's only when it becomes real that it can change your life. And real, it's like I was saying before, when you hear a truth that's real, it shifts something within you, and you see the world in a slightly different way.
So what he talks about is that the theoretical is useful once you have the meditative.
Exactly, same thing. When you have the theoretical, so the theoretical, he wasn't as much into the theoretical as other Kabbalists. But what's the theoretical? The theoretical is what he calls that computer, right? So he talks about that, okay, God is one, right? We learned this, the Shema, right? God is one, but how does that oneness interact with the vast multiplicity of our world? Well, there's many different things. He calls it a computer. I call it God Inc. because it's like a corporation, you know. But it's but that so he sees it as, you know, so just like in a company, you have the person who welcomes you at the desk, and then you have the person who does this and does that. In Kabbalah, you have different parts of the one God that interact with the multiplicity of our world and the other thousands of worlds, to run them all and to make them work and to bring. Because what I love about Kabbalah is that it's organic, and that it matches in some ways the way our natural world works, which is complexity from small forms and structures into greater forms and structures. And if God is real, why wouldn't God also have that kind of shape? For me, the idea that there's just this one God and that's it, and you can't understand it, feels very not real. But the fact that God, to some degree, is kind of like the natural world, or there's no small to bigger, following patterns, and everything is interconnected, feels a lot more real to me. And so he says this later in the book, but what is God in the end? God is like the soul of the entire universe, just like a body has a soul. So God is the soul of the universe. It's the spiritual structure that brings life to everything. You know, if you've ever, this is my experience, but as a rabbi, every now and then see a person when they pass away. And it's always so powerful to me when you see a person pass away. It's scary sometimes because of the rigor mortis coming in, and it's just a very, very real experience of what life is and is not. But when you see life, spirit, you know, kind of enlivening a body, it's amazing what that body looks like. And the moment that goes, you look at the body and it's like, this body is nothing. Just like, it feels like, it's just like, just to see it is so, it's like, this was a person. You just can't believe that was a person. You just look at the body. I could never imagine that person this is a person. It just seems like, it looks like a mummy, right? Rigor mortis. It looks like a mummy. It's like that.
It's unrecognizable as a person that you knew.
it's unrecognizable, right? And so it's that spirit of life.
Something has evaporated.
Yeah, like something's just gone, right? And
The
there's-
light goes out.
Yeah, it's like the light goes out from it. And so that spirit that enlivens a body is also what enlivens the whole universe in this understanding. Anybody else have any? Go ahead, John. Yeah,
Well, I had, my favorite part of the reading
yes.
was the first paragraph of the spiritual dimension,
Uh-huh.
where it talks about God being simple
Mhm.
and absolutely one, and
Yeah,
kind of undifferentiated.
yeah,
And then, when we pray, we have attributes of God, we have all sorts of ways that we break it down, but that isn't, what he's saying is that
it's
that's
all
not
one, it's all
really,
one.
it's all just undifferentiated oneness.
It's,
And then there has to be these structures to make space for us.
well, there's two ways of looking at it. One is that it's kind of like, well, is your hand John? Is your nose John? Is your eye John? You would say yes, right? It's all part of you. So just like our will controls our whole body. And so they would say just like that, God's will envelops, but still you would say to a cell in your body when it's fighting another cell, where's John in all of this? We're both John, but somehow we're in, so there's a that's one way that the Kabbalists kind of will look at it. But they say everywhere in Kabbalah that there's just a unity, but the part of it is just so God also can interact with our physical mind. So I sometimes share the story of the movie Contact. I mean, I don't know if people have maybe seen the movie Contact, right? So at the end of it, Jodie Foster is given plans for a maybe I'll keep Contact for another time. I won't get. Let's keep to the book. Anybody else have any other comments or thoughts about the book?
Well, also just the,
Meditation is a form of altered consciousness.
Yeah.
To fully understand it, you need to have an altered form of consciousness. And it all fits. But if you're not there,
That's exactly what Aryeh Kaplan says, and he talks to his people, and he actually said to his people that if you haven't experienced this altered state of consciousness, you won't be able to understand it. And I don't think he ever got into the whole LSD thing in the 60s, but he said that the people who had taken that, he said he didn't want people taking it on his watch, but he said they had a better understanding. It opened something up for them and being able to understand what it was. It was like a little thing of it, but he was a from very, very serious about his, but he said that that opening of mind was somehow helpful to understanding some of this stuff. Anybody else? Laurel, you're about to say something?
oh, just when he talks about the paradox of God having to withdraw himself to allow us to make room for us to be here, but then if God really isn't here, the world collapses, so how do you have both
What did you,
the tenuousness of the I don't know, God, part of God being here and
like where is God within the physical creation kind of thing, or how did you understand that part, or just the idea of it?
I didn't, I still think about that.
No, it's
Well, it
it's
sort of helps explain why the world is such a mess, right? I mean, that's a problem, right? If God is good, then why is creation so full of things that are not good? And
well, it's well
Wow.
God, because God, so the like other systems, it's like that there's an infinite gradations of spirit, right? You go from the most concrete to the most spirit and all of it, but there's the idea that God has to withdraw from the concrete to allow the concrete to work, but the more God is withdrawn, the more there's stuff going on here. But in Kabbalah, the whole cosmos, God in the absolute is perfect. There's no taking away from that. But once you get closer to less pure spirit, everything is always in motion and flux. And so that there's forces in our world that are working to help bring everything in line, to help bring blessing into our world so things go well. And a part of it is it's trying to steer the whole universe to self-knowledge. And the only way that self-knowledge comes is through friction, right? you only learn if there's friction, right? This is psychology, we talk about this, right? If there's no movement in your psyche, you're not gonna learn anything, right? You can feel your whole inner world. And so it's like the same thing with all the world. It's only the friction of life that allows us to evolve and to understand who we are. And so a day for us is 1,000 years for us is one day for God. So this whole universe's purpose is to know itself and to develop, but it just takes a long time because we're all on the long road. And the long road takes a long time for humanity and the universe to come to goodness and to learn all the lessons and everything. It takes tremendous amount of time. And so, if our universe is like one tiny drop in the overall cosmos of creation, that when our world comes to a place of self-knowledge, it then adds that self-knowledge into the greater universal mind of all knowledge. This is big ideas, right? These are really big ideas. But so I don't know, anybody has any other ideas? We'll do maybe five more minutes and then we'll talk about next steps for people. Anybody have any other comments or thoughts or anything they want to talk about?
That's a good time to mention Thursday morning class, because if you really want to talk about this every week,
Yes,
it
sir.
kind of happens, right? On Thursday morning.
Yeah, Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. We talk a lot. We talk about this stuff often lately in the class, in my class. So maybe to take it back to the book, that a lot of it is historical, right? He talks about how the Kabbalah was transmitted from the prophets and down to the rabbis, and the rabbis kept the secrets, and they kept the secrets, they kept the secrets. And so the part of it is this experience of what Judaism is about, the power, that we're going back to the power and the consciousness of it, what we're talking about today, exactly what we're doing today, that's what was transmitted down, the conversation we're having today, that's what was transmitted down. And that's not something that you can easily put in a book and have it be, it's not something that can be, but that's what was transmitted down, much better than I can, but from one person to the next, down and down and down. And that was the key to understanding what the Torah was really about. And when this started to come alive for me, when I started on my path to the rabbinate, after spending a year in Nepal, because actually in the East, this is a lot more alive than it is in Judaism. In Judaism, we struggle a little bit spiritually. We do a lot of things very well, but spiritually we're not as alive as, in my mind, as other tradition. But there was very alive. I come from a family where it was, but I'd forgotten about it or how it came alive for me. I came back and I went to study in Jerusalem in the Pardes Institute. And I remember from where I was then, looking at the Torah and studying the stories of Abraham and Sarah, and all these light bulbs going off, like, oh my God, these stories are about their journeys. These stories about their journeys in spirit and the different experiences they have and how they learned and understood more. And at that moment, I didn't have that much knowledge, but the teacher in the class was this really old-time rabbi and everything there. And, at one point he came up to me and he whispered in my ear, "You really understand it," or something. He said to me, "I'm also a contemplative," he said. I'm like, oh wow, okay. So he was the head of this whole center, when we were Rav Meir Schweiger. Anyway, great guy. He wasn't happy that I went to the rabbinical school I went to, but still, so be it for him. But I think that when this is alive, it makes sense and it brings spirit. And musical Shabbats, talk that's alive. All these things are things that help, I think, bring spirit into Judaism, because the Judaism that's filled with spirit is, first of all, a lot more inspiring and give us something in our lives. And also, when you transmit that down to the next generation, I think they're a lot more likely, if it's alive for them, to continue on with it. Because if not, then, because guilt doesn't work anymore, or only works for some people, and so the idea of, and in the marketplace of ideas, Judaism has to fend for itself. I used to be, you were Jewish, you had no way out of it, but now you're in the marketplace of ideas. And so I think this is really important that this is coming in, and I think that post-Holocaust, post-State of Israel, we're in a whole new period of Jewish history, where this is coming back in a way that's very important for Judaism. And I'll talk about that way more in the other sessions. Go ahead,
Who
Norma.
are the men of the great assembly?
So it's men of the great assembly. It's this concept that the truth is, so you right, we have patriarchs and matriarchs. Then we went down to Egypt. We were taken out of Egypt. We wandered for 40 years. We went into the land of Israel. And then we have all these years that were documented by the Bible, the Tanakh. When the prophets lived, the book of Kings, the book of Samuel, the building of the temple. Then the first temple is destroyed. All that is documented in our own Bible very carefully. Then we went to Babylonia, the first exile, and then we came back to the land of Israel. But then there's this period from then until the end of the second temple where we have almost nothing. We just have almost no historical documents. We don't know what happened, but we know that at a certain point we went from prophets and the temple to rabbis. But we don't really know how we made that transition, but the rabbis, they talk about that there were these people called the men of the great assembly who were kind of like prophetic, like the earliest rabbis who had an assembly who lived in this period of the second temple. And they were, even though there was a temple and sacrifice in the temple, they were beginning to talk about, scholarship and Torah and these ideas, and became more intellectual. Did they really exist or not? In what form they did or not? Who knows? But we have this hole. We just don't know. We don't know what happened during that whole period, except that we know that the worship went on in the second temple. We know it became more corrupted. We know there stopped being prophets. And so within Judaism's internal story, what the story is that when the holiest moment was Mount Sinai, but then it continued on because we had the 10 commandments that were from Mount Sinai. This is our story. And then in the tabernacle and in the first temple, those 10 commandments were there, and that brought a power into the whole kingdom. And there were prophets who heard God's very word, and spiritual experience was alive for your everyday person. This is basic 101 Judaism. And then what happened? First temple was destroyed. Second temple, we no longer had the 10 commandments in it, and the priesthood was corrupt. And so it was still a very special time, but it was going downhill until the destruction of the second temple. And then the Shekhinah went into exile. What is the Shekhinah? The divine presence. And then suddenly there was no more. Then we were just focused on survival, wonderful things, but we didn't have that Shekhinah. And so we pray 3 times a day, restore the Shekhinah to the Jewish people. That's in every single Amidah. What does that mean? Because the rabbis felt, we're not prophets. We have to create a religion without knowing God's word. But those who came before us heard God's very word. So they felt the whole Talmud, this is what scholars talk about, it's full of the rabbis' anxiety, because they were anxious because they felt lesser than those who came before them and felt they had to create a Judaism of survival that was based just on their own minds and their own thoughts and some sense of divine inspiration, but they couldn't hear God's very word. They felt lesser spiritually. And so the whole Talmud is full of the anxiety of the rabbis on who are we to create this Judaism that all of us now live when we're not doing it. So they created all these ways of saying, well, we don't know God's word, but I can interpret the crown on that letter in the Torah, and I'm sure this is what it means because I have no other way to prove that what I said has that authority, right? So this is like the internal story. So you see how the internal story of Judaism actually correlates very well with the Kabbalistic story of Judaism. All of it is actually really interlinked.
How's that? Oh, that left.
How it's interlinked? Well, that the internal story of Judaism is times were the most powerful and spiritual and connecting to God in biblical times. We had prophets in the temple, right? Then we lost the Shekhinah, we went into exile, and we went through 2,000 years of suffering, right? And what's the Kabbalistic idea is also that the prophets had something really, really special. But at the time of that, they no longer had the experience, they just had to pass it down a lot, they had to write it down, and and it became very obscure and secretive what was before. So that's those two stories are actually completely at some level interlinked. Go ahead, yeah.
Were
of
they
course.
the Essenes?
So this is the, right, the Essenes live at the end of Second Temple times, and they were also some kind of very spiritual community, and they disappeared after the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple, but there were all of that was very much part of biblical Judaism, but then stopped being part of it with the rabbis. And so us modern Jews, what we tend to think about is, oh, the biblical times, that's when they were primitive and sacrificed animals, and we never want to go to that. But the traditional view of Judaism is, okay, maybe that stuff is primitive. We don't want to go back to sacrifice in the temple, but that there was a level of spirit that was alive then in biblical times that right now we just aren't able to because we're in galut, we're in exile, and we have to focus on survival and on making sure that Judaism doesn't disappear. And if you actually read, most of Judaism is built, the Talmud is built to help Jews survive, right? It's form little communities, force you to learn your language, don't marry outside the faith, don't do all these things. It's all about preserving Judaism through terrible circumstances. But it also gave us a lot of compassion for others who were going through suffering. It also gave us, a mind, wonderful mind from studying Talmud. It gave us all kinds of things. But within our internal story, the religious internal story, the prophetic times, the patriarchs and matriarchs, and maybe this is the final thing, that within Judaism's kind of basic, this is all Midrash rabbinic story, they say that Abraham and Sarah, they lived the whole Torah without having received the Torah yet. That a lot of the character, what does that mean? It means that living the Torah isn't about all the details, all the words, all the commandments. It's about a state of being and a state of consciousness. And so, in the end, where I find powerful about this also for us who are not Orthodox Jews is that one can live this without getting into all the minute details of trying to fulfill every little law, just by trying to live some degree in the spirit, because they talk about it, like it's possible, Abraham and Sarah, and even they talk about when Moses first gave the Torah to the people, there wasn't going to be 613 commandments, there's going to be the 10 commandments, and everything was great. Then the people sinned at the golden calf, and so they had to be given the oral Torah and all the other laws and all the other things, because they couldn't they were in a state of mind where they were naturally living moral ethical laws, but within their nature was too much other stuff. And so they're like, no, we're going to have to actually codify moral and ethical behavior for you to live some other way. And so that's also, the idea is maybe in some ways one can live some of it where we naturally live what is the spirit of the Torah, while I'm not saying we shouldn't do mitzvot, we should definitely do mitzvot, but I think we don't, maybe the intricacies and details of all of it, for not everybody, for some people that leads you to it, but for some people it leads you away from being able to live in this kind of consciousness and awareness. I guess, a very big discussion of all kinds of things, Kabbalah, everything the first thing, but next time, we'll go more into the details of the next chapter. And the next class we'll be do once a month for the first beginning Monday, April 7th, 7 p.m. Monday, April 7th, 7 p.m. Same place.
Oh, it's gonna switch to Monday,
What's that?
David's
It's
class.
switching to Monday.
What's that? Oh, right, that's Monday. That's right. That's David's class. Okay. Forgot about that. Okay, I'll be in touch. I'll figure out another date.
Is that Thursdays right before Passover?
Yeah, that's why they want to do that Thursday, because that Thursday is right before Passover, and then once you get them to Passover, and maybe we would do during the intermittent days of Passover, maybe we'll do the 17th of April. That's a long time from now, that's why I'm not,
Check with him to make sure he might not be having it that night.
yeah, no, I'll check with him. But, I'll
April
let-
3rd is not right before Passover.
I know, the problem is that April 3rd is, well, what's happening at the same time, we have this fundraising campaign, so there's a parlor meeting that night at somebody's
it.
house. So,
Fair.
So then,
Thank you.
chapter 2 is
so
the-
chapter 2 for next time, yeah. Chapter 2 is a bit, is longer. Well, a lot of the things they talk about in chapter 1 that we didn't address, all the different texts and all the different periods, we'll address throughout all of it. And there's both what he says, which is a traditional Orthodox view, and there's a scholarly view, but I don't think it impacts the overall thing. That what was transmitted from generation to generation was the power, the knowledge, but also the power behind the knowledge, the state of mind to understand it all. And that then in certain moments in Jewish history, there were openings where that was expanded on and became more popular, and then went from that and made its way into traditional Judaism, right? So when the Ari, you know, in the 1500s, suddenly he was one of the great mystic interpreters of the Zohar and others, the Ari Isaac Luria, when he suddenly had this moment of opening up this experience and this way of looking at things that transformed the Jewish world. Half the prayer book suddenly put in all of his prayers. Everything got filled with all of his practices and thoughts, and it completely changed Judaism. But we still to this day have prayers in our Siddur that go back to him and what he brought in. And actually, it was his students that made up the Lecha Dodi, and they made up the Kabbalah Shabbat service, and it was his students that created the main body of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, that came from the Ari circle in Tzfat. And so much of Judaism is actually completely interlinked with Kabbalah, that it's really, it helps understand all the rest of it. So thank you, everyone. We'll talk
Thank
more
you.
next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Roll.